Welcome to Let's Talk, a show about talking to kids about race and racism. I'm your host, Karen Tao. In this episode, I meet with Andrea and Roberto. Some of the things we talk about are the importance of affirming their 5-year-old son, Emiliano's identity and heritage.
For him to be claiming, this is who I am, and not, I'm gonna pronounce it in a way to make you feel comfortable.
To accommodate others. We also talk about a parent's role in advocating for their child. You are making space for him outside of his home where he feels like he belongs. You know, Emiliano is 5, and I imagine he's noticing lots of things at school and on the playground, and wondering about the kinds of conversations that he brings up or questions he has.
He already notices he's one of the few kids of color in his class, so he's pretty aware of that already. He's told us, Mama and Papa, we're the dark-haired family because all of my friends are light-haired family. And we were very surprised at that such a young age. He's already was noticing those things.
Which is pretty common at that age. It's, how do I look in comparison to my friends? What did you say to him when he said, I have dark hair and my friends have light hair? What was the conversation like?
I think we validated his language. We didn't try to correct it and saying, actually, they're white. We don't mock it. We don't shame it that he's not using the right word, like light. But we actually say, oh, that's a very good observation. That is a moment where you take a step back as a parent and like that construction, he's seeing it very differently. And in my perspective, it's race.
I think we just said something like, and you both are really cool kids.
Terminology, I think, is a tricky piece around parenting, because you said we went with his language, lighter and darker, and at some point using their white and you're brown, you'll use that sort of language more. Because other folks are probably identifying him as brown or dark-skinned. And so I guess I'm curious as to kind of when that conversation starts to happen. I can speak for myself. It happened earlier than I anticipated, and we had conversations around that, who's white and who's Asian and who's brown and who's black. And so, curious as to when that conversation might happen.
I don't know. It causes anxiety, because I wanna be ready for it. I mean, I think back at my kind of, racial identity development, and I don't know that I had those conversations with my parents. It's just something I had to learn on my own. I hope when they do come that I'm ready to listen more than talk, I guess I could say.
Right, which is, you're not alone. I think lots of us didn't grow up having these kinds of conversations. But I think what you spoke to is more around the anxiety that comes up when we are having these hard conversations. And earlier you talked about, well, I don't want to burst this bubble quite yet around what the realities are around race and race relations, because we're struggling. We're really struggling as a society and as a nation to have these kinds of conversations, and having them at home with your child, I think, is the place to start before he goes out and starts having them with other people who might not share similar views as you.
My fear is that when he does start public school, or when he starts a different school where there's older kids, so like the probability of him having a teacher that looks like him is not the greatest, very low. While at a preschool setting is pretty high, because that's what he's had. He's had women of color who speak different languages. And so I feel like they understand some of the anxieties or worries that we have as parents, as first-time parents, but also parents in a very non-diverse setting. So I think like these conversations may come sooner, because I think the demographics in the schools where he will be entering and the educators that he might encounter are very different.
One of the things that comes to mind for me was you know, so we're here in Utah, obviously pretty predominantly white, you know, city and state. And so coming from California, Southern California, where it was a little more diverse, especially where we grew up, that's definitely a conversation we have a lot of how do we raise a young, you know, brown kid here in Utah with resiliency and strength and courage and confidence. So the intersection of race and gender, you know, do we toughen him up? Do we make him ready for, you know, what he might experience out in the real world? Do we, you know, get him ready for that and tell him this is what might happen? And, you know, thankfully I have a compassionate and loving wife and spouse who says, no, I think actually we actually have to teach him to be proud of who he is and to really love himself, to really build that resilience up for him, because he's gonna need that, you know.
Yeah.
He's kind of connecting the dots now that not only do we look different based on our hair and our skin, but also the language that we speak. So he's more aware of his friends. So when I speak to him in Spanish during pickup, he'll say to me, Mama, English. And when he says that to me, I say, but I speak Spanish.
What's that like when he's very clear
Yeah.
about kind of where to speak Spanish, where to speak English, and he's directing you that when you're
Yeah.
at school, I want to speak English.
Yes.
And so what's that like as being a bilingual family?
I think one thing we both have talked a lot about is we don't want to associate any sort of like guilt or shame. At the previous daycare what he was at, they asked just a simple question like, tell us about your son. And I think it was more about like allergies or it was about, you know, maybe they sleep with a blanket. But what I did is I actually wrote about the importance of affirming his culture and his language and asked if it was okay for the Spanish-speaking caregivers to speak to him in Spanish, and that it was important for them to make it natural, part of their everyday talk. And so
It normalizes.
it normalizes
Yeah,
these
absolutely.
these values. We can think of so many scenarios as parents, like, you know, why is it that these kids are not hanging out with him? Or we worry about those certain things of like someone being mean to him. We haven't had that interaction with him, and that's where my approach was for Roberto. I said, you know, we live in a world where any sort of media representation or film, he might get a different messaging. So I wanted us to be more compassionate. So an example is we've seen that sometimes he holds in his cry, like he just holds it in.
Yeah.
And we constantly, to soothe them, say, it's okay to cry.
Right.
It's okay to cry. It's okay to be upset.
Where's that gender piece?
Yes.
Girls coming in at this age as well, about boys needing to be tough.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you talked about the intersection of being brown and a boy
Yeah.
and representation and what he sees in media, and may not have the full range. He might not be exposed to the full range other than at home with you and maybe within his family to see the way that boys of color can express themselves and cry and be sad and let it out. I was thinking about, just as you were talking about your role in his school, and that you're a parent at home, and when he gets to school, you know, the idea is that, okay, now the school will take care of him, but that's not always the case. You had to be an advocate, that you had to be a spokesperson for him. And what I was thinking as you were describing that is, you are making space for him. You are creating a space outside of his home where he feels like he belongs. School is a place where he can speak Spanish. It is a place where he's seen for his full person. That takes a lot of just sort of energy, I imagine, to go into a school and to ask for that, but so important so that his identity is fully seen. Seems like you haven't thought about that.
When you're married to an educator, every moment is a teaching opportunity.
Right.
So.
There was one instance, it was very, very quick, where somebody mispronounced his name. And I said, that's not my son's name. And so every single place that I go, I make sure that the teachers who he interacts with knows his name. And right now, you know, in kindergarten, they're supposed to know their letters and their colors. But one of the ways that we teach him at home is his full name.
Right.
If you can say Tchaikovsky, you can say Emiliano.
Agreed. Yeah.
I mean, so
Yeah.
the thing that comes up for me is I really empathize with kids of color that don't want to be of color. That was one of the things that growing up, that was part of my development, is not wanting to be called Roberto, wanting to be called Bobby or Robert. And I understand why that was happening. It was a way of adapting to a pretty unsafe environment that I was in. And so, you know, now going back to, you know, raising our kid, I really want him to be really proud of who he is, where he's from, you know, because unfortunately he will have challenges, he will face challenges in this world, in this society. And again, it goes back to my name represents not just, you know, what my parents named me, but actually my culture, my heritage. And so for me, that I think what's important.
To be proud of that there's a history there, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Like
and-
he knows he's named after his great-grandfather.
Right. I resonate with that idea because I'm thinking every time there's a moment I want to teach my kids something, I
Yeah.
wonder
Yeah.
when to stop teaching.
Oh, yeah.
How do you know when you're done?
So we were down in southern Utah, and when we got there, I said, because he's older now, and I said, Emiliano, this land belonged to the Native American people.
Sure.
So when we come, we need to be thankful for the opportunity to be here. But he was not there.
Right. He's like, let me go on this hike.
Yes.
Yeah,
And,
and-
so that was a moment where I wanted to have this whole
Sure.
conversation
Well, he was
about.
he's little.
Yeah, I wanted to take it beyond.
Yeah.
And so he looked at me, and then we looked at each other, and we just started hiking, right?
Right.
He connected that back to even the way we talk about his ancestors and where he comes from. But what he said, you know, maybe as he grows older, we'll talk about the history, right? The history of these places.
You just sort of expose them a little bit and then
Yeah.
move on. I think I share very similar experiences as you. I see the eyes kind of glaze over, or I see a distracted, you know, they start to run off and do
Yeah.
something else. So I think that that's one of the things that we as parents need to recognize is sort of how much can they internalize and make sense of. And but realize that he did make the connection.
Yeah.
He did make the connection that he also has ancestors that he's respectful of and a heritage. And so those moments where I'm like, yes, you know,
Yeah.
I didn't know that they were listening, but they were listening.
Yeah.
And that, but then what happens is that we can continue the conversation.
Yeah.
That it isn't from square one.
Yeah.
But I know that oftentimes at the least expected sort of moment, your child might come up to you and say, remember when?
Yeah.
And have you had those moments where you're
Oh,
like, oh
yeah.
my gosh, I didn't even realize you were listening to me? And what that does is it creates this open dialogue. Then he knows when he comes to mama and papa that he can say anything and you're going to hear him and maybe share some of your own wisdom. And then when his eyes glaze over, then you stop, but then you know that you can always come back, that there's no
Yeah.
end point and there's
Yeah.
no beginning or end to it.
One of the things that I was kind of thinking about as we were talking is accountability. You know, he's a boy of color as well, and so you know, there's definitely the issues of race that he's going to face, but also of gender. You know, he has some privileges, and one of the things that I hope to instill and we can instill in him is when he does harm somebody, if he does, he will harm somebody. People harm people. People make mistakes. To really try to take accountability for that, maybe even microaggressing other folks or misgendering folks or you know, any of those things, because I think that's also something important that as parents that we hope that we instill on our young boys particularly.
Yeah. Sounds like you all are rocking it and doing awesome. And it's
Can I get a certificate that says that,
Yes,
please?
yes, I will. don't you wish that we got parenting certificates? Because I really rely on validation.
Yeah.
I don't really get that very much as a parent, but I hope that these kinds of conversations do validate me when I hear you stumble too and that you have these successes as well.